Welcome, Austin, Al, and Jim. Today, I thought we'd talk about a couple of things. First, I'm going to talk about SPI and how they got into fantasy and science fiction, and then we're going to talk about Jim's greatest hits. Jim, there were a number of science fiction and fantasy games that SPI did. Probably the one that's the best known is that you did a number of Lord of the Rings games. How did that all come about?
We got a license. We had to pay, and it was as simple as that. We were early on. Anybody who came after us paid a lot more. I don't know how long that license went, but we shipped a lot of product. That also got us into what was it? Toys R Us? Not Toys R Us. One of the big retail outlets. Anyway, it was in a hard box, and it was a good game. I didn't have a lot to do with the design. I was not into fantasy and science fiction much. Well, science fiction a little, but not much into fantasy at all. I think Richard Berg and Greg Stickin and they pretty much took the lead. I don't have the credit on that one. I don't know who's credited for design.
It's Richard Berg and I think the other gentleman you mentioned,
Greg Stickin. Yeah,
right.
They did a good job. And that came out quite well. In fact, Richard Berg, he passed away, 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah, a couple of years ago, yeah.
He had a fairly illustrious career after SPI. He, I think, was one of the most prominent, post-SPI published designers.
Him and Mark Herman. Yeah.
Him and Mark Herman's right behind him. They worked together a lot.
Right.
So the legacy, lived on. I sort of kept an eye, and I got on mailing lists. I was put on mailing lists for various publishers, and I got some of the gossip. And I even got sent some of the games. The good stuff, the hobby had changed after the computer games came out. In fact, I think this is something that I was surprised. Well, I shouldn't have been. I took over again for about a year and a half in 1889, 90, so whatever, when it was run by an outfit, not Decision Games, but the outfit before them.
Anyway, 3W, yeah.
Yeah, 3W. And one of the things I did was I got back control of the feedback system, and I ran some of the questions we had run on periods and in demographics. And what happened was what I was not a surprise that. First of all, there were very few new gamers coming online, in the 1980s. Computer games were becoming the thing, the sort of uber geeks, that we attracted all switched over to computer games. Now, that was no surprise. One of the, at the last few Origins conventions I attended, one of my lectures was Napoleon at IBM. And I basically, from what I understood then, which was fairly accurate, I was about 10 years too soon, I described how, computer games would take over, why they would take over. One thing I underestimated was the first-person shooters. I mean, there are still a lot of strategic-type games, which is basically what the SPI games were. But the first-person shooters, and it wasn't a surprise when it happened because I realized these are arcade games, the ones you had to literally go into an arcade to play. But Nintendo and the game consoles, which are still around. Although today, most of those games are played on PCs. That's why you have so many PCs with, really pumped up GPUs, as they call them, video cards. But there is still, a small market. Now, what happened was, after the Cold War ended, I ran a survey right after I was there long enough for the Cold War to end, 1990, 91, and bingo, like a rock, interest in contemporary warfare, plummeted. And it was basically picked up by the older periods, Civil War, pre-20th century and what have you. Contemporary games have since come back. Partially that's due to Joe Miranda and Decision Games. I think Joe has finally broken my record for the total number of games, published games in his lifetime. he's welcome to it. But he does good work, and he did a lot of contemporary games. There over the years, there were games in Afghanistan, Iraq,
Right.
Korea, you name it.
Yeah, they actually have a magazine dedicated to modern war, and out of all the game publishers, they're the ones that push the modern stuff the most.
Yeah, and they seem to have hung on to the feedback. That's something a lot of people didn't realize how important that was. It's great if you can give the people what they don't know they want, but if you just give them what they want, it works very well.
Right. Now, GMT has done that with they have a P500, and
they let you buy in, as it were, and if you get the 500, they can break even and they publish it. That's very successful. That was very smart.
Yeah.
But we had the same deal because our feedback and our sales. I readily did regression analysis on that, and it was like 0.9 something, which is unheard of. But I mean, it was very close. Basically, if you give people what they want, they will buy it. But that only worked on our scale while there was a large number of gamers. When I left, SPI, Strategy and Tactics, had its peak about 35,000, and it declined after that. Not so much because of I left, but because of the trends which I was telling everybody, winter was coming, so to speak, to use another social phenomenon, and winter did arrive. But there's still a market for those older type games. I mean, most of the SPI games are out of print, although there's a lively market, in secondhand. They're trading, continuing the trade. The prices keep going up. And Decision Games has been publishing, refurbishing a little bit and publishing the ones that basically come out best in their surveys. It continues.
They've done deluxe versions of some of the games. They've taken some of the bigger games. In fact, let's get into that a little bit. But before I get into where your best sellers or your highest ranked games are, what I'd like to do is ask Al and Austin, and then I'll pitch in. Al, what do you think Jim's best game was?
I'm still really going back to 1914. I think it was not necessarily the most spectacularly good game, but it had so many new ideas that showed you what the system could do, what gaming could do.
What were some of those, Al?
And I made up for the things I did wrong because, as Al pointed out, it was the first game. A lot of new ideas, but a lot of not of the finesse that I came to admire later. The best World War I game I felt was the little World War I game.
Yes.
The one where you had a strategic map, and that really put the whole war into perspective. I mean, we later did, a game, what the hell was it? There was another, more simpler game, the one with the Plan 17 rule. What the hell was the name of that game? Anyway, and we also did World War I games on the Eastern Front, which did fairly well.
Right,
Again,
you did Tannenberg, and
Tannenberg was one of those. Yeah,
we would have done more if people had asked for them, but they didn't. I mean, we kept rolling it out in the feedback, but basically, that didn't faze people. They said, "Oh God, they keep beating this dead horse." But occasionally, we'd spur their interest, and we'd do one, and none of them were blockbusters, but they all made money. So what can you do?
Now, World War I wanted to talk about that one a little bit. I actually just picked up a copy of it off of eBay. Like you said, there's a pretty good market of reselling Strategy and Tactics and SPI games. And that game, Decision Games did a deluxe version of it where they expanded it some. But I've got to tell you, Jim, when you look at it, the rules for that are only 7 pages long, but it is so tight and so well done that, I've got to think that that's almost one of the best designs that you did.
A good design on a nasty war. I mean, the basic problem of World War One, it was such a slog, and even in 1914, when there was a lot of movement, you don't get much, and then boom, you hit the wall. I paid attention to historical realism. Again, that's it's more so than with Jutland, which was a naval battle. I mean, there were a lot of ways that could have gone. But with World War One, we could validate it, and validate it. We did. This was something that shockingly people down in the professional war games business in Washington were only vaguely aware of. In fact, a lot of them said, "Validate? What's that?" But there were a few people down there, like Andy Marshall and a few others, who knew all about validating and the lack of it. Because the politics got involved, this is what we want. We don't care what is. Russians had an even worse case of that, and it's still a problem to this day. I don't care what reality says. I want this. Bingo. Vietnam in a nutshell.
Right.
Because I later found out they did a lot of wargaming on Vietnam, early on and throughout the war, and it was like the poor guy in the Russian Stavka, the new guy, was told, "All right, game out. What's going to happen if we attack today in NATO?" And the guy comes. As years went by, the guy says, "Oh, we're not going to win." And then it became back, we're losing. That was the message in the 1980s. So you got a regular stream of guys being exiled off to a remote, scientific city to ponder his errant ways. But the nowadays you have two generations of officers, and this began in the mid 70s when they had me down at lecturing classes at the Army War College, and I gave them a quick class, and I got feedback eventually from brigade commanders. Well, actually, at least one 4-star general. What the hell was his name? But anyway, the advice I gave him, I says, the war gamers are everywhere. And I said, just put the word out in your unit if you want some of that talent, and you'll have a bunch of officers and perhaps two bright enlisted guys, willing to help you out. Now, in the 70s, this was a lot easier because the draft was gone. It was all volunteer. But even when I was in the 60s, in my artillery battalions were about 300 guys. There was easily maybe 10, 12 wargamers, enlisted and officer. That was rather surprising. But they're there, and they're still there. And you have people who came up through the ranks, officers in particular. I don't think there's many sinks, the combatant commanders in the geographic commands who don't know what the war game is, the importance of validation, or have key people on their staffs who do. Another bit of irony in all that, in my researches, and I think Al might have seen this too, General Patton did a after-action report. Remember those big volumes, Al?
Mm-hmm.
It was
a truck to carry one.
Yeah, but Patton's was most illustrative because he surrounded himself with very sharp, staff officers. That's something he doesn't get much credit for, but he understood it, and he saved his butt more than once. But in the analysis, going into France, he came in effect on the second wave. He had already done terrain analysis, analysis of the relative combat capabilities of American and Russian and German divisions. The Germans took one step further. They analyzed Allied divisions and gave them a ranking. It was sort of a alphanumeric ranking, or what have you, and how dangerous they were. And we got a hold of all that during and after the war. And it was surprising. I mean, the German approach was, analytical, like Trevor Dupuy, Colonel Dupuy, and
right.
his numbers in combat war, whatever that's a great book out there.
Oh yeah, the prediction book.
Hero is what
that was the organization, which was around until I think recently. But anyway, he scarfed up a lot of that information and basically confirmed what the Germans had found. And
Right. I've got on my reading list right now as I go into a 4-week downtime because of some medical issues. I am reading his Battle of the Bulge book, which is all based upon his numeric research that he collected from the Germans and the Ally stuff. So
yeah, and I saw a lot of him because he recognized that he was doing it differently than we were. He was more a correlation of forces. I never said that to him, but when I got to learn more about the Russian way of doing it, that's what they were doing. And in fact, the Russians, even before the Bolsheviks took over, were very much into the German style of analytical, study of warfare. And some of the best books we ever encountered on what was going on, especially on the Eastern Front in World War I, were these books translated into English, from Russian. I think, Al, you remember that. What the hell was it? Anyway, they did enormous analysis.
It was Russian casualties in the 20th century, I think.
Well, no, that came at the end.
Yeah.
But before that, they had done some books on World War I analysis, apparently published before World War II, got translated. My Russian was never good enough to read a lot of them in the original without a lot of pain and effort. But I did. I got some of their World War II stuff because one thing I discovered from the CIA was that you could buy a lot of these books. They were widely distributed in Russia. They were obtainable. The CIA had them. The Air Force translated. They had a translation service and what have you. But yeah, that last one, the casualties of the 20th wars in the 20th century, mainly World War II, was a real milestone and an eye opener. That's when we found out that the Russians lost 18% of their population during World War II. Most of them civilians killed, as side effects, as it were, collateral damage to the combat. But even then, they lost 10 million soldiers. And that was a secret until the end of the Cold War. That was a state secret because they didn't want people to know how, or I suppose Russians too, how badly Russia was hurt.
Yeah.
They always called it a glorious victory. It was basically a damn we won victory. As they stood in a smoldering wreckage that was Western Russia. But anyway, we basically all fed on that data. The manual war gamers used it differently than Trevor Dupuy did. In fact, a lot of people, the books I've read recently about especially since Trevor's died because he sued everybody, in sight for the least, cause. Except I never got sued. I mean, I knew his reputation. I just tiptoed around him carefully. He was somewhat discredited because he basically bent his numerical method. He didn't use the looser method that the war gamers used, and that took something away from his work. But the thing that stands is his statistical analysis, collection of data, and what have you. And that's still, the gold standard, as it were.
Yeah, the book was Numbers, Prediction, and War.
Yeah,
and the from what I understand, I've got the first edition, but I'm actually looking for the second edition, which is really hard to find, where he cleaned up his numbers.
Yeah.
So because there were apparently some errors in the first edition, but all his stuff is great.
Yeah.
And he tips his hat to the war gamers in Numbers, Predictions, and War, and talks about the great work and he was referring to SPI, the good work that you guys were doing.
If you look at his Trevor Dupuy's testimony to the House Armed Services Committee, I want to say it was in January of 1991, just before Desert Storm, he's put on the spot, and if I recall correctly, it was Les Aspin who was head of the House of Representatives of that committee at the time, as to how many casualties that the Allied coalition would take if a ground war erupted in out of Kuwait. And the number was, I'm doing, the number 438 sticks in my head for some reason, but I think that was the actual number. He said about 450 was he had done doing his calculations. And this was at the time that you were having these published figures in the usual sensationalist media of 20,000 or 100,000 dead, including civilians and the like. And I recall looking at a clip of that testimony, maybe 94 or 95 on this, and thinking, remarkable work. I just put a little SPI Jim Dunnigan frame around it, and that war game I did, Arabian Nightmare, when Jim and I were fiddling with numbers, and I did it on the back of an envelope. I wish I'd kept it. I came up with about 1,500.
Yeah,
and that was because about 4 or 5 play tests, including one that Mark Herman was involved in when I was up in Washington. There was always an incident where an Iraqi unit managed to hit an American unit that was exploiting a gap. And when you're hit on a flank or the rear, even with modern weapons like surprise, you're going to risk taking big casualties. The reason I'm not to get off on that, but Jim's made the point we're using similar methods.
Okay, so Austin,
and an important aspect of the Gulf War was that was the first combat test of the post-Vietnam all-volunteer army. Now, we all knew, those of us who studied it, that the training was much higher, it was much more realistic. They had the National Training Center, but we didn't realize how much of a difference it would make. But as Austin was pointing out, we didn't know that something like 73 Easting, what happened, that one battle where the armored cav unit ran into a Republican Guard armored division and basically destroyed it. That was not something you could predict unless you could adjust for the value of the training, the relative value of training. Now, there were also stories coming out before the ground fighting started. In one case, the Iraqis raided a Saudi border town.
Khafji was that attack?
Yeah, they were repulsed by the what do you call it, the white army, the tribal army, the National Guard. And it was fairly bloody, but I think it was General, but the guy was in charge of the American guy. He went up there, and this was published, and he just inspected the wreckage and whatnot, and he was rather surprised at the poor state of maintenance of the Iraqi vehicles. They rode in with some armored vehicles and trucks and what have you, and a lot of them didn't make it back. But even though even a damaged truck, disabled truck, a practiced eye, as it were, who'd been, observing the maintenance levels of units for many years, he looked. He said, "Boy, they aren't cleaning these things. This thing looks like it's going to, have an engine failure, or it's not getting lubed. Little things that add up, and that's really basically what eviscerated the Iraqis. Even with the Republican Guard, they had." They were all hand-picked. They were Sunni Arabs, loyal. They were picked for loyalty, but they got the best equipment and what have you, and they got the most training. But again, the Iraqis and Arab armies in general, they don't pay a lot of attention to the peacetime detail. And that's one reason why they keep failing compared to, say, the Israelis or anybody else, or the Western armies that went up against them in the Gulf War. So that was basically a reality check, an adjustment. And that's from that point on,
Austin. So since
I want to make this is really interesting. I'll be brief on it. But Jim, 73 Easting was the exact kind of little armor attack that one coming in on a flank that we got in the game, and it's hard as heck to come up with casualty estimates on that, because this is where history informs wargaming. But and by the way, McMaster was in that, was 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment. And you were going to ask me a question.
Yes. Before that, since we've been talking about the Kuwait War, if anybody wants to do Austin's was a grand tactical strategic game, but if you want to do the battles, they're Frank Chadwick did a game called Sands of War, and I think it was his expansion that you can do the Quake battles at the tactical level. He also wrote a great book called, and so did Jim and Al on Desert Storm, but he wrote one that was called Desert Shield that he got out before Desert Storm even started, which is real interesting.
Are you talking about From Shield to Storm? Jim and I did.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay, Shield to Storm.
We got the Arabian Nightmare game out before the fighting started.
That's right. It was. The original came out in December of 1990. Dan, you were talking about how those compact rules back in the World War I game that Jim did really at the strategic level on that, and you said you thought it was really clean. The word I use to describe a game like that with rules like that is elegant.
Yeah.
And I've used this on Jim before. I'm pretty sure I've dropped that on Al, and it's because it all works together real well. And you ask Al, mentioned, top flight games that,
right, and that's what I was going to ask you next. What was your?
I was going to add something about 1914. I was I think a senior in high school when that came out, and my debate partner Roger Stewart, who later ended up being on Admiral Rickover's staff after he got out of college, brilliant guy. Instead of working on our debate, the debate problems, we'd play 1914, and I was just struck by how detailed it was, and you're looking at, somebody who's a history freak, and I was thinking, good gosh, I'm really getting to try to experiment with this. I'm just to tell you, Al's was on target with that. But the two games, I think, Panzer Group Guderian, for one thing, about the way that you use, Jim, you get a tactical feel out of an operational game, and it's kind of exciting to play, too. But the other one is Bulge, which is, I think that came out, Jim, when? In 1980? Yeah,
yes.
79 or 80.
And it got remarketed as the Big Red One, the tie-in with the movie.
That was part of the deal with I forget who it was, Paramount or whatever,
right.
To get the rights to the Lord of the Rings. Was we had to do another game that had a tie into something they were doing, and so we had the Bulge game. I hadn't out yet, or I don't believe. And we said, okay, we'll just call it the Big Red One. And they were pleased, very pleased. Now, one reason why the Bulge game was so elegant, that was about the sixth game on the Battle of the Bulge I did. And one thing that always hacked me off, well, initially, the first Bulge game that Larry Pinsky did for Avalon Hill, it didn't have a lot of the historical detail that was available, but they didn't know about being down in Washington. You had the World War II Records Branch and various other places that were open to the public. But I got all that data, and I did have some very complex games. That was early on. It was 1970, 71. Bastone, I think it was called, something like that. But really, I understood that the attraction of the Avalon Hill game was simple. It was accurate enough, but it was very simple. And I said, I can outdo that. And so what happened with the Bulge game was I had all this knowledge in the Battle of the Bulge and gaming the Battle of the Bulge. I could confidently go in there and basically cut out a lot of the fat, as it were, and concentrate just on the key elements. And that's what made it, a classic. Same thing with Napoleon at Waterloo.
Yes, and that's in your... That's in the Board Game Geek Top 25 for you, is Napoleon at Waterloo.
You hang around Al Nofi long enough, you learn a lot about Napoleonic warfare.
I'm sorry, that's too funny.
Speaking of poking a bayonet in my back, keep it right, keep it wrong, keep it accurate. That, and of course, that was designed from the get-go as a simple introductory game, so we couldn't mess around.
Yeah, but it's really not simple, Jim. That's the thing.
Chess is simple. It had all the basic elements there, but they were accessible. A lot of people who weren't even war gamers, I said, look, think of it as glorified chess. That worked for games like Napoleon at Waterloo. probably with the bulge too. In fact, that was the whole idea behind the quad games. I says, why don't we do a whole bunch of these damn things?
The blue and
they
the
all-
gray series.
right? And a whole bunch of Napoleonic games,
Right.
modern period games, and of course, as I think you've already pointed out, decision games. When they surveyed, they said these things are still popular because they're beer and pretzels games. You can sit down,
Yeah.
you can be half in the bag, and you can still get something out of it.
So Napoleon at Waterloo had some significant legs because SPI published it in several different formats. And then Decision Games went on and did it again, but they took it one step further. They put it out as a computer game.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
it's I'll tell you the truth. I had a hard time getting my boys to play war games with me, but one of the ones that I got one of them to play with me a couple of times was Napoleon at Waterloo because the rules were easy to explain and they were able to play it with me.
Well, the thing with the computer games is if you were good, and a lot of the game designers now or developers are good, you can make the rules intuitive. In
Right.
other words, and that was always a problem. Nobody wants to read the rules. Like, hey, can you tell me how to play this game? We'd have the famous sign on the play test room, walls was RTFW. Read the
Right.
friggin' rules. And if they didn't know what that means, we'd spell it out for them. In the original language, it still aggravated people. I tell the staff, I say, look, the only solution to this is to keep it simple, and that's why I allowed Redmond free reign to institute his codified system, literally. And he basically, had the authority, as it were, to throw rules back if they didn't comply with his clarity and organization rules, and that worked. I mean, there was a lot of grumbling, but the more experienced developers realized that a lot of people are going to get this game with no experience whatsoever in war games. They're not much, or maybe only some old Avalon Hill games. Which some tended to wander, and that made a big difference. And I think that case system is still in use.
It's still in place. And in fact, when people wander from it, they hear from, okay, this is a game I'd like to play, but the rules are so crappy, I can't.
And the same thing happened with computer games. Initially it was they were designed for programmers, and that's always a mistake. I mean, I always hammered away, even at SPI. I told the developers, and I've been doing that ever since because I'm still in software development. I says you got to do this with the user in mind, and in this case, the user is a professional currency or bond trader, or somebody who's got a lot of smarts, a lot of capability. I says, but they're not computer made. Even though a lot of them play computer games and whatnot. But that's the problem now. The guy or gal in some cases will come in and we'll give them a new interface. For our data system, it's sort of like a Bloomberg system, and they will complain. I said, look, what the hell? How do you get this? Bring this up. It's got to be intuitive, and finding out what intuitive is to your particular audience is not easy. A lot of it's trial and error, but that's something we did for the hobby. We basically did a lot of the trial and error, and as you pointed out, people who stray from the the highly organized, tight system. Get feedback, and it really gets back to writing in general. I think there was some 18th century writer. He wrote a letter and he says, "I'm sorry this letter's so long. I didn't have time to do it briefly." And
Right.
that is basically a catchphrase for
I've
writers
read that.
in general ever since. And that's what we try to do in strategy page. I sometimes wander on. But I'll reuse the same pieces over and over again, and I'll keep tightening them up. I can drop this, I can drop that, and they get better and better. And people don't complain because a lot of these pieces, people go in there, they haven't seen any of the older pieces, and all they realize is, hey, this new stuff is tight as hell, and I can read it in 3 minutes. I understand what the heck's going on with this or that.
Right.
And it's the same with the games. The rules can be an obstacle to playing, much less enjoying the game. And
so
I'm
going to tell you the game that I don't know if it's, I know it's in the top 25 on Board Game Geek for you. And it's maybe not your best design, but it was the most enjoyable for me, was Time Tripper. And
Yes. That was one of my favorites. I mean, again, that was just a couple of brilliant ideas executed, elegantly, and that turned out to be, it's still a favorite. I did a little surveying of Board Game Geeks and Grognard.com and what have you to see what the most popular one was, and I was rather pleased. They said, Time Tripper, have you ever seen that? And then I read down the message thread, and they said, oh, yeah, I hadn't heard of that. That's a Dunnigan game? Well, if it's simple and fun, it's probably a Dunnigan game. But a lot of guys working at SPI, Greg Kostickian in particular, he picked up on that. And while he was developing games for SPI, he did like the Creature That Ate Sheboygan.
Yes.
Very simple, and God knows they spun off God knows how many variants on that for your favorite city being destroyed by a monster. But if you can design a basic system that is clean and elegant, you can usually apply to a lot of games. So we did that. We had game systems, which we often applied to half a dozen or more games with just minor variations, obviously different order battle, different map, etc. And we'd add things. And Panzer Group Guderian benefited from that. I forget what the system was. I think it was our operational game system in general. But again, each game demands some unique elements. And of course, the thing with Panzer Group Guderian was the intelligence. Now, normally we leave intelligence out, but here you got a situation where the Russians and the Germans both were ignorant of which Russian units were good. That's a somewhat unique situation. Usually, both sides have a fairly good idea of which units they can depend on, which they can't. The Russians couldn't, and so the simple idea of putting that in there, and I think I used that first in the Franco-Prussian War. And there was a discussion once when I'm saying, I think I've seen this before. Am I borrowing it from somebody? And so, like, yeah, you borrowed it from yourself. You did it in American-Prussian Wars. Oh, okay. But it was much more important in Panzer Group Guderian. It applies in a lot of battles, but in some cases it's crucial. And that was the case in the Franco-Prussian War and especially in Panzer Group Guderian. After that first year of battles in Russia, there was no longer, that was no longer a big factor. The Russians had a pretty good idea, who it was a death match, as it were, for the Russian army. Those who survived, you guys are pretty good. Keep it up. But the problem was, after, the war is over, how do you basically capture that and sustain it? And that's something the Army picked up in the 70s after the Vietnam War with the National Training Center. And again, one of those, two things they were doing in the 70s that I got mixed up with: reintroducing the study of history in the Army and bringing back war games. That's a whole other story. But basically, we were the place to go because we were doing it. In fact, I didn't realize that there was a market for contemporary games until a bunch of guys down at the infantry school got on my case. And I said, okay, send me the following manuals, which I knew, I would probably use. Bingo, this box shows up. And that was, what was that? Mech War? Not Mech War.
Well, there was Mech War 77 that you did, but you did something before that, and I can't remember what it was.
See. I'm looking at the list here. American Revolution, not Combat Command. Red Star, White Star. Yeah, that was it.
That was it, yeah.
Yeah. And we got another surprise with science fiction games. Now, Redmond Simonson was a big science fiction fan, and a lot of the gamers were. I mean, we'd have that question, I think, when he first expressed his desire to us to do science fiction games. Again, the feedback system was not just used to find out what the customers wanted. It was used to settle any squabbles that were among the staff. Everybody considered themselves an expert, whether they admitted it or not. And I was the first one to say, look, I don't know. I'm going to ask the customers. And so that sort of settled down some of the larger and more outrageous egos floating around. There were no shortage of those. So we asked questions about, science fiction, and bingo, it came back, and I think Redmond did the first one. What the heck was the name of that? Star something or other.
Right. Yeah, he did that series, and I'm trying to remember what the first one was. The follow it up on was Outreach and Star Soldier, but he's actually recognized for that first one of doing some very innovative things, and he had psychic powers in it and a bunch of other stuff. So
yeah, the thing with Redmond, he proposed and he got involved in a couple of games. He he didn't practice what he preached. His games were often convoluted, and so I learned early on to quietly slip him some of the best developers. And I told him, look, if he bites your head off, come to me. I'll put the head back on, and I'll make it all better. Redmond understood that. I mean, I told him point blank, one-on-one a couple of times. I says, yeah, and he sort of grimaced at me. He didn't take criticism well, especially when it came to art matters, but in design questions, and the feedback and the rules, he understood he was hoisting on his own petard because he himself embraced these tight rules. But I said you also have to have a tight gaming system, and he eventually accepted that. But again, it involved a lot of to and fro and a lot of one-on-one discussions and what have you. He was that was part of his talent. He was very demanding. He demanded much of himself and anybody working for him. Unfortunately, he would sometimes apply that to people that weren't working for him, who just happened to be in his way when a little death breath came out. But I joked with him early on. I said, look, I understand you're the creative in terms of art and what have you. I will not ever, trespass on that, and I will spread the word to others. And he said, yeah, as temperamental artist. I said, yeah, temperamental artist. But anyway, he could control that more than you can control the design of games. That was a little more difficult. It was like herding cats. And that's why we always had a hard time getting, good management in there to supervise the developers. I was running the damn company, so I initially I did it, but once we got larger and larger, I had more than other things to attend to. And Terry Hardy was good, but we couldn't pay him as much as he was making, in the corporate world. Brad Hessel wasn't too bad. He turned out pretty good over time. But again, herding cats. And in fact, the ultimate solution for that problem was to, by the late 70s, it was possible to farm out, and they basically solicit games from outside, from independent designers. We got a couple of those early on. Some of them were very good, like Winter War, but a lot of them were crude. But once Redmond had his system, which we published in one of those war game design books,
right.
We gave all the tricks of the trade away, so to speak. So we could tell people, look, if you want to design a game for us, and I went on with this on the Outgoing Mail, the outgoing editorial, as it were. I wrote for every issue of Strategy and Tactics. I said, this is how you do it. And we started to get more coming in. And, of course, what I wanted to do towards the end, when I saw the contraction coming because of the computer games growing in popularity, even if they weren't graphic yet. Well, some were sort of graphic, but it was pretty crude. I said, look, we got to contract. We got to basically rely more on outsourcing, independent designers and developers. And Redmond didn't really want to give up on that. He liked having all his people, as it were, in-house. But, that was something that eventually happened, no matter what anybody said.
Right.
Because nowadays, it's almost all outside submissions. It's remote.
Including the developers.
Exactly. Because with the internet, you can do that. You can get away with that. I came in 98 to come back in 89, 91. There was some, networking. I was on CompuServe and the Genie at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I could recommend to people designing games for us to get onto one of those systems and to email me files and what have you. And save yourself a lot of trouble. I mean, the future was coming, but it wasn't fast enough for me. And that's another technologist disease. But anyway,
let's talk about something that we haven't talked about. You mentioned it. You just mentioned it, but you have in the top 25 on Board Game Geek, you did a number of modern stuff. You did the Next War, which was a monster again, right?
Yeah.
But
and
you
again,
did
simple mechanics. It was
right.
It was a large, simple game.
And then Berlin 85 and Fifth Corps were very popular.
Yes. Now they were simple, and some people criticize us for that. But again, these were situations that never actually became reality. Thank God. But if you compare those game systems, if you applied it, and I think some people have, to contemporary situations that have become actual wars, you'll see that they did stand up. Again, you make much better adjustments if you're validating against a historical event where it actually took place. But I pointed out from the beginning to the guys down at Benning, I says, look, we can do it, but we're going to basically be validating it against historical examples. Well, at that point, we had the 73 war, several wars with the Arabs and Israelis, and they were a font of reality check information. But when you go farther into the future, it turns into fantasy. But then again, we found out that fantasy games are tremendously popular. After the science fiction games went out there, we started doing fantasy stuff. And we already knew Dungeons and Dragons was very popular. But we also found out that fantasy board games did very well. In fact, my outdoor survival game became such a bestseller, I later found out, because it was adopted by a lot of D&D players as a strategic game system to set up, their actual, tactical, battles, as it were.
Right.
That's something that is still the case. Your computerized games often have a strategic game that you can drill down into a tactical game. In fact, Anzio Beachhead was like that. No, Italy. Yeah, whatever. There was a game we had where you had the strategic game of the entire Italian front, and then you had it feeding into what was going on at Anzio. I think that was the way it worked. You don't have a lot of opportunities to do that, but that was a case where it demanded it. I mean, what was going on at Anzio and what could have gone on at Anzio? I mean, that could have been a dramatic victory if we hadn't hesitated, in getting out of the bridgehead. But the Germans had to basically respond in the correct way, and they did, because that was their doctrine. So you have a lot of these ideas which are basically timeless. You just have to recognize it and use them.
Right. So,
Dan, could I make a point? You were talking about NATO games in the mid to late 70s, and we're looking, tried, Red Star, White Star, and the like. Weren't you thinking of Firefight? I think that was... No,
that came later. Firefight was done...
That was 76 or 77, Jim.
Well, yeah, but it was done for the Army. At that point, they'd hired us, as it were,
right.
To try and introduce game. I mean, those are the games you came across. But before that...
Oh, I got to play test it for 7th Corps. I know. I mean, what a complete... That's a different...
But now, see, the thing is, the NATO game, which I did... I think partially to provide something that the Army War College needed which turned into their mechanic theater model. They like that. They played the heck out of those. I mean, we sold a lot of copies. I gave a couple of freebies. I felt like a crack dealer. Yeah, free samples. You got to buy the rest. And but they found it was accessible, and it was accurate enough. But then they got the mechanic theater model, which computerized the whole operation, so you could do it, as a classroom exercise, and that got the ball rolling as far as developing a generation of senior military leaders who knew what the hell this could do and how it did it, and that made all the difference in the world.
Well, we haven't had time to talk about everything. Mainly, I've picked titles that we hadn't talked about before, but if people go and look, they'll see that there are others there, but they're covered in our other
we can do one or
episodes.
two more sessions because I'm looking at the list of my games.
Right.
And I'm saying, I could tell you something about this one, about that one, about that one. Yeah, I'd say about 10-20% of the games I did, I really thought came out very well. A lot of them came out well enough, and there were a few turkeys. But anyway, that's worth recounting because again, some of the things we learned in doing those games is still valid.
Hey, well, we're in control of this, so we'll figure out. One of the games that we're actually going to spend a whole episode on is Empires of the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about it as a board game, and then we're going to talk about how it moved on to the computer. And the computer game we were all involved with to some extent. But Empires of the Middle Ages is another one that Decision Games reprinted, and because of its popularity.
Yeah. I used that game. I taught a strategy and strategic theory class in the honors program at the University of Texas for 15 years, and I used Empires of the Middle Ages to give them an idea of how to look at long-term actions through history. Yeah. And it does it. It captures it.
Now, one of the interesting things is my understanding about Empires of the Middle Ages was that Eric Lee Smith took that system and converted it into a science fiction game called The Sword in the Stars. Is that correct?
Freedom in the Galaxy. I think there was Freedom in the Galaxy. Again, I'm a little vague on the details. This is 40, 50 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, Freedom in the Galaxy was sort of a let's do Star Wars, but let's not get sued for it.
Yeah, that's true.
So,
yes, even systems like Empires of the Middle Ages, which you'd think be a one-off, is applicable. In fact, we discussed that, doing a 20th century version. And of course, there were the success of the Origins of World War II, which is a very popular, very playable game.
Right.
I know a lot of non-gamers who got off on that one.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll do another session then. One of the things I was thinking about, too, is when we wrap this whole thing up is that maybe our last session we could do some question and answers, have people post questions over on YouTube, and then I'll get on Bonding with Board Games and do another session with them and ask their listeners to post some questions for you. What do you think about that?
Excellent.
Okay. Well, we'll wrap this up for today because we're pressed for time in our real lives. This is our enjoyable part of our life, and now we've got to go back to the real world. But thanks for being here, gentlemen, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye, Dan.
Bye,
guys.
All right. Take